I have two pleasurable duties tonight on the 20th anniversary of Sorensen. The first is to recognize Emily Couric, who many of you know was our state senator from Charlottesville and died an untimely death. She was in the inaugural class in 1993, and Tyrone Green, her classmate, is here tonight, fortunately. And secondly, to give our first Founders Award in recognition of the contribution of Professor Walter De Vries. And Walter De Vries is a very interesting, unusual fellow. He was born in Holland, Michigan. He was one of seven male children of his family, all of whom were immigrants from Holland. He received his undergraduate degree at Hope College in Michigan and later his advanced degrees from Michigan State. He served as the executive assistant to then Governor Romney of Michigan, became a fellow of the Institute of Politics and the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and then returned to Michigan at the university where he was a full professor. He was the author of several books, interestingly enough, most of which were around the topic of the last book, which was entitled Checked and Balanced: How Ticket Splitters Are Shaping the New Balance of Power in American Politics. He formed his own consulting firm in 1969, did public relations, polling, media production, and campaign advisory. And then in 1988, he was lured by the Reynolds family in North Carolina to come from Michigan and to form what became the North Carolina Institute for Political Leadership. And the thesis that he had was that, and was given in part by the family, was that you should find people that would not otherwise think of going into elective politics, encourage them to do so, and to train them, to learn things about North Carolina political issues, and then hopefully encourage them to go into elective politics. He was very successful in this effort. He has spawned 4 different institutes, interestingly enough, one in Ecuador, one in South Africa, one in Michigan, and one at the University of Virginia. And the brief history of the Virginia Institute, which later became known as the Sorensen Institute, was that I was sitting in Baltimore. My son was a civil servant, and I was reading a magazine that was on his coffee table. It was called Governing. And on the front page of the Governing magazine was Walter De Vries. And they told the story about what he was asked to do in North Carolina. And I became intrigued, and I got in touch with him, and he said, well, this is coincidental because you're the second person from Charlottesville who's called me and has been interested in perhaps replicating the Institute of Virginia. So I found out the name of the individual. His name was Michael Bills. I'd never heard of Michael. Made a date to meet him for lunch, and I thought somebody my age, was probably then in the 60s, would walk in the door, and here this young man who looked like a Californian came in with a wide open shirt and a gold necklace around his neck. And he was a graduate of the University of Virginia, had made his fortune in New York, working for a man by the name of Mr. Robertson, and had retired to Charlottesville. And he was very interested in doing the same thing that they had done in North Carolina. So we put our heads together, and through a great deal of sweat equity and a certain amount of luck, we were able to convince John Castine to permit us to take a shot at it. And I was convinced that the University of Virginia was going to turn us down because they didn't want to have an organization there, as it was described earlier, who might be spawning candidates who would run against some of our prime politicians who were interested in the University of Virginia in the General Assembly. And then I thought, well, when we were turned down to the university, we'd go to George Mason. They were more entrepreneurial than perhaps they had in Charlottesville. And if we were turned down there, we'd take another shot at it and try to do the same thing that Mr. De Vries had done in North Carolina, a freestanding institute. But John Castine, to his credit, said, if you can raise the money, I'll take it before the Board of Visitors, and if we receive their blessing, you can have an opportunity to do it. The greatest thing that we did was hire Bill Wood from the Norfolk newspaper, and we were able to raise the funds and to put the class together, the first being in 1993. And I was an erstwhile duck hunter, and I was sitting in the A-blind in the Chesapeake Bay with Fred Scott during the course of this effort. And the ducks weren't flying, as they generally don't where we hunted. And he turned to me after I'd given him this pitch and said, Leigh, you're out of your cotton picking mind. It'll never work. It won't be successful. Why should I even think of being supportive? Fortunately, it has worked, and he's been one of our principal supporters, and we're in great debt for him. I'm sorry that Walt De Vries couldn't be here tonight. He has illness. I believe his son is here, perhaps? Executive Director, and I would hope that he would come forward and we could present the first Founders Award to him and indicate how much in his debt we are. Please. Say anything? Sure.
I am not Walt De Vries. He is my mentor and one of my heroes, and if I had a vote, I would be sitting in my chair over there listening to him. He was unable to make it today. He did call me on the way up here. I drove from Durham, North Carolina, and he called me on the way up here to tell me the story of Emily Kurek and how well she did on her television interview in the first class, which at the time was the Virginia Institute of Political Leadership. He, in a room full of public servants who I'm honored to be here, he is the greatest public servant I've ever met. He spawned not only the Institute in Virginia, the one in North Carolina, where he currently sits on our board, the one in Michigan, South Africa, Ecuador, and we just launched the Massachusetts Institute of Political Leadership. He is responsible for more public servants in our country than I would put against anybody. And I'm honored to call him on my board, I'm honored to call him my mentor, and I'm honored to call him my friend. He asked me to tell that story about Emily Kurek. He also asked me to tell you a joke. We've heard some good ones tonight. I don't have a good one, but I will tell you that he would say, if he were here, that of course you're honoring him, because if you live long enough, you will be honored by some foundation or some organization at some point. And at the great age of 85, I believe now, he is the best public servant I've ever met. So in a room full of public servants, I thank you for your service. I thank you for the ability to accept this award on his behalf. And I thank you for everything that you're doing at Sorensen. Thanks.
In conclusion, and perhaps paraphrasing not very well Jim Lair, politics is a tough trade. It destroys families oftentimes. It causes individuals who perhaps were of a benign nature to be very partisan. And I think that we're in the debt of all of the people in this room who have considered elective office and have offered themselves up. And I'd like to thank in particular Barbara Freed, John Hager, Bob Gibson, and Bill Wood for supporting that effort. Thank you.